This is TOL, breaking news, Brother Chooch reporting. We have some important happenings. According to The Guardian, online, UN voted on Gaza stabilization to force a plan that references a Palestinian state. Netanyahu faces pressure from the far right after Saudi insistence on credible pathway to statehood. The UN Security Council is to vote on Monday. Now, this vote already occurred, so this was written a little bit before the vote. On a U.S. drafted resolution to set up an international stabilization force in Gaza. That includes a late and highly tentative addition to a future Palestinian state. Added under pressure from Arab states. A rival motion has meanwhile been tabled by Russia and China, setting up the possibility that both motions could be vetoed by one or more of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The stabilization force comes from Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza, which also calls for the disarmament of Hamas and demilitarization of Gaza, as well as the reconstruction of the devastated territory and its placing under the authority of technocratic Palestinian administration, answering ultimately to a board of peace to be chaired by the U.S. president. The new force, the draft says, would receive a 2-year mandate under the resolution and help secure border areas, protect civilians, secure humanitarian aid and corridors, and work on the permanent decommissioning of weapons from non-state armed groups. The U.S. text, backed and outlined by the Gulf states, France, and the UK, has been the subject of intense negotiations, including the insertion of a reference to the future formation of a Palestinian state at the insistence of Saudi Arabia. It says that so long as reforms have occurred and the rebuilding of Gaza is underway, then the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Okay? And this all is under Trump's 20-point peace plan and the Trump-chaired Board of Peace. This plan ultimately may be heading in the direction where Israel will be pressured to have to agree on a 2-state solution. And if that's the case, then what is written about in Joel about the nations dividing my land and being brought to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which would be Armageddon, will be working towards that fulfillment. In Mimri, which is a Saudi Arabia press, has this headline, and this was published too on November 17th. Saudi writers said, consenting to normalization with Israel before the establishment of a Palestinian state would violate Saudi Arabia's principles and be an offense against justice. So it is clear that the meeting between Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's to visit the United States tomorrow on November 18th, they are expecting that Saudi Arabia will hold fast to insisting on a 2-state solution. The article goes on to say, It should be noted that prior to October 7th, 2023, there were advanced talks between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. about expanding the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia. But then, too, the Saudis set the establishment of a Palestinian state as a condition. They now cleave to this position even more firmly and have promoted a plan for a two-state solution along with France, which the UN endorsed in September this year. The Saudi-France initiative includes a right of return for Palestinian refugees from 1948 to their homes in Israeli territory. And finally, from United States Mission to the United Nations website, explanation of the position before the vote on a U.S. drafted UN Security Council resolution on the situation in the Middle East. This was delivered to the Security Council. And I want to highlight some aspects that was spoken of today. And by the way, this was passed. Colleagues, for 2 agonizing years, Gaza, home for over 2 million souls, has been a crucible of conflict, a hell on earth, where Hamas' brutality and terror met Israel's fierce response, leaving rubble where schools once stood and graves where playgrounds thrived. The death toll climbs in the tens of thousands, hunger gnaws at the vulnerable, and hope flickers like a candle in a storm. But colleagues, here today, November 17th, we stand at a crossroads. Today we have the power to douse the flames and light a path to peace. The path is the draft United Nations Security Council resolution before us, a bold, pragmatic blueprint born from President Trump's 20-point comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. Moving on, this was what was later said. At the heart of this plan lies the Board of Peace, a transitional administration with an international coordinating, restructuring financing from a dedicated trust fund backed by the World Bank itself to rebuild shattered lives, homes, hospitals, schools. That's what we will see with this resolution. Not talking points, but actual deliverables. And crucially, per the carefully negotiated language in the 20-point plan, this resolution charts a possible pathway for Palestinian self-determination after the Palestinian Authority has completed the necessary reforms. This has language that sounds like it's leading to Palestinian state. But here's the real thing that jumps out. Listen to how this ends. Colleagues, the eyes of history and humanity are upon us, right here, right now. A vote against this resolution is a vote to return to war. Time is not on the side of peace. This is not the time for endless debate and lawyering. The clock is ticking like a time bomb. So let us vote for this resolution, not as a compromise, listen to this, but as a covenant. For the children of Gaza and for peace that endures and for a Middle East reborn. Folks, this has prophetic language. Not a compromise, but as a covenant. This could all be coming together to being the strengthening of the covenant, which will give, at some point in the future, Israel will be allowed to rebuild their temple, but at the cost of land being divided, God's land being divided, which may trigger the wrath of God for dividing his land. Could very well be we are getting really close to that tribulation period, because we know that the tribulation period is started with the signing, the strengthening of the covenant. Folks, it's something to think about, something to pray about, something to ponder on as we get closer and closer to our blessed hope. This is Brother Chooch reporting. for TOL Breaking News.